All right. I'd like still to bring out one or two more points.
Actually, can I ask one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
it's always that way.
All right. I've been trying to formulate. The problematic relation between the singular and the universal.
Yeah.
You mentioned erupted in Kant, and I was just wondering if you could comment on the reason why you think that happened. Why Kant?
Reasons. I don't really even sort of ask those questions because they tend to suggest a kind of causality, and I'm not in a position to. I don't know if one can, but I certainly don't feel that there are so many different factors going on. Why somebody at a certain point, you can, for example, you can trace a certain genealogy. Let's say, Kant is, for example, responding to Hume. That's one of his big, not so much adversary as challenges. And, Hume setting up shortly before Kant the idea that all causality is essentially speculative, that there is no objective causality. It's based on routine. And that the fact that one thing follows from another gives you no reason to assume that it necessarily has to or will for all times and so on. So, that's sort of the basis of what's been known as an empirical approach to reality, that there really is nothing, there are no general laws, or certainly no universal laws, that are extrapolatable from empirical sense experience. And what Kant does in his philosophy as a whole is to take that challenge very seriously, but also try to respond to it. One of the interesting dimensions of that challenge, which is a kind of skeptical challenge, is that if you think of it politically, which I think is also in the back or ethically, it very often tends simply to be amount to a justification of the status quo as power relations. In other words, something is done in a certain way, is a convention. But if there are no reasons that you can adduce for the conventions, then it's simply, they've been established, presumably by the stronger over the weaker, since that's the way a good part of society is organized. And that's something that Kant was aware of, and very didn't want to accept. So it's not just idealism, it's a German idealism as opposed to Anglo-Saxon empiricism, but it also is the idea that to accept a kind of radical skepticism in that sense is to condone basically existing reality simply because it exists, which is often politically a result of unequal power relations. You see, for example, Hume writes an essay called something to do with taste, on the history of taste, on something about taste. I don't remember the exact.
Logic of taste?
No, it's not that, but it has something to do on something with taste. You can Google it or so on. And he himself asks the question. He says, although he says it doesn't seem to be any overriding causal principles. Things happen, but because out of convention or habit, but they don't have to happen that way. It's very interesting that over the years there is a certain constancy in what's recognized as, let's say, classical art models. Everybody, Homer, Shakespeare, etc. And the question is that just chance, or is that just convention, or? And he writes a long essay on this, which I haven't reread recently, but I'll give you my memory of the upshot of it. And that is that basically the relative permanence of taste, or the relative consistency of taste, despite the fact that there are no a priori principles, has to do with the fact that you have a consistency in the conoscenti, in those that in a society are the taste setters, and that they tend to think similarly. He doesn't say they represent a similar social class or something, but that's a little bit what's implied, and that therefore that's the reason why you have a relative, consistency in models, you see.
Of the standards of taste?
Pardon me? On the standard of taste, exactly, of the standard of taste. Yeah. During the course of these 3 days, I'm going to mention a lot of different names and texts. The reason I do that is to give you bases for further reading. Mm-hmm. Because the way I consider a seminar in general, particularly a 3-day seminar, no matter how intense, is you throw out suggestions and thought. But this isn't to impress you, it isn't to intimidate you, it's to give you, I'll try to say why I'm mentioning the names I mentioned, not just name drop. But if I do, mention them, it's to give you, if you want, to follow this out. And everybody has their own trajectory that they're following. And but if it does seem, that you have some bibliography to work with next steps. So this is an interesting, Hume is certainly an interesting text to read there on the standard of taste there.
Hume is after Pascal, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Because Pascal had that same sort of thing where he said, what was it? The quote was like, anyone who tries to build an ivory tower of philosophy builds it on the foundation of sand.
Yeah, right.
So,
and Montaigne also in the Montaigne is also a French Montaigne, who's sort of considered to be one of the fathers of modern skepticism, a very modern thinker in that sense. Montaigne, very interesting, some person to read, also a very good writer and so on. And Montaigne and Pascal are two really key figures whom I haven't worked on enough, but who are very, very key. For example, Derrida has written a lot on Montaigne, and as Pascal also. Pascal is the one who also, as far as I know, introduces the idea of the leap of faith, you see. And these are all people who, in the very, very schematic history that I'm giving you there, would be, although operating within a Catholic country, responding to the kinds of problems that you have polemically articulated by Luther, let's say, of this problematic relation of individual or singular and universal. Only they're responding to it within a Catholic country where you have a relatively stable political and social structure and religious structure, which is stable at the cost of having massacred the Protestants, and so a very bloody kind of stability, but that there is stability, relative stability there. And that's, of course, quite different in let's say, in Germany, let's say, or even in England. Kant doesn't just drop from the sky in that sense. He's operating, as every thinker is, in very specific contexts. And I always tell my students, and try to think that way myself, is to try to figure out what are the challenges, problems, and questions, often unstated, to which a writer is inevitably, in some sense, responding. I think this is a general. I have a sort of a formula for that, which I suggest that they think about also in terms of themselves, their own writing and their own thinking. I call it a response appeal. In other words, every act and every act of writing, I would suggest, is in one way or another attempted to respond to unresolved and challenges, questions, not necessarily yes or no responses, but problems that are unresolved, and that because of what I outlined before as the nature of language, as what I take to be always an essentially open system, therefore always in some sense constitutively addressed at readers, whose response is in turn is necessitated as a way of confirming what can never be confirmed internally, in terms of the internal logic of a system. You see, that's where the notion of signification as opposed to meaning. That's another distinction I try to make between signification as a process of pointing somewhere else that can be arrested temporarily or blocked, but that never can be fully fulfilled or totalized. And given that situation, there's always every act of writing is a writing for and against, or in response to, not necessarily one person, but myriad. It could be complex issues. It can be identified with people, with systems, with problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so, in a certain sense, that means that a certain rhetorical structure is constitutive of the very process of linguistic articulation. That's, I think, an interesting argument. It's not by no means simply accepted. There is no self-contained, closed structure. I think it's the same way in art, as far as I know, with any significant process, that it's always in some way responding to and appealing for further responses from. They don't have to be responses of justification or verification. There can be all kinds of responses that can be appealed to, and so on. It depends on the context there. But this idea of, so that, writing, for example, I don't know if this helps or hurts when you have a writing block, for example. But one of the things that I think would be useful is to not think of yourself in a totally isolation, going back into your own history and trying to examine, as we say in English, where you're coming from, to try to figure out what are the sort of unresolved problems that are really moving me, that are determining what I focus on, what I exclude, why do I do that, and when what kind of responses am I hoping to have from whatever I'm going to try to do, beyond getting a PhD or whatever, which is perfectly legitimate. But when you write, you're doing also something else, obviously. It's not just that, although it's also, it's also that. A kind of a response appeal structure, I think, is useful so in that sense, now Kant himself, by the way, just it shouldn't have started on Kant because for me he's an absolute central figure, particularly the third critique. But I'll just mention one more thing, and that is at a certain point in the critique of judgment, the famous the third critique, the power, literally the critique of the power to judge. And the reason that's important is that awkward translation is important is because it's not sure that there is a judgment. This is not a critique of judgment as something that's there. It's the critique of the possibility of being able to do something like a judgment, which leaves open, I believe, the fact, is there a judgment? Is there such a thing as a judgment in aesthetic? Can you speak of the aesthetic, is it really a judgment, and so on? I think that's an unresolved question for that. And that's why he speaks, therefore, it's interesting, where totalizations no longer are taken for granted, a language of energy and dynamics tends to in place. See, Kant uses, for example, it's a critique of, in German, Urteilskraft, which literally is the power of judging, the power of judgment, you see, the capability. And so the shift is from a given reality or a given entity like judgment to the question, is it really possible under certain circumstances to judge? What is involved in that, you see? And this is, his one of the ways in which he's responding then to the skepticism of Hume and in general, and yet trying to establish firm bases for criticism, or critical thinking. And that's one of the interesting things is that one of the metaphor he uses for critical thinking is that of the court, the tribunal. So in other words, the danger is if the skepticism of Hume or Pascal, Montaigne, he's really concerned with Hume there, is allowed to go unchallenged, what kind of criteria are left for making any kinds of decisions, and making value judgments and knowing what is true, what's not true. He's a good philosopher. That's what one should do and what one shouldn't do. Are there any of the And I think the interest for me of Kant is not that he resolves those problems, but that he articulates them through his struggle to resolve them. He tries to resolve them. But it goes down to his very language. Very often English translators of Kant try to make excuses for the fact that he can't write a straightforward sentence without adding 10 million parentheses, where he's sort of saying, well, it's sort of like this, but not exactly. But that's what's really interesting in his text, is that precisely you get a kind of a tension, like a drawn bow, where he doesn't allow himself to have easy resolutions, and therefore he keeps putting in qualifiers and parentheses and so on, tying himself almost in knots. So you can see it as a kind of dramatic. But if you have a translation that's trying to filter that out, you lose a lot of that. So there have been recent translations that have been more literal. 2 recent translations that no longer try to make him into a smooth writer, as it were, and it's all for the good, I think. So to go back then to Luther, don't get me wrong about what I'm trying to suggest with Luther. I'm not suggesting that any kind of direct causality, either of what Luther is doing or of his effect. All I'm suggesting is that something is articulated in Luther that I believe is very significant in the following year, for what follows. You say where, why, they're very, very complex issues. I don't pretend to I mean, obviously the situation of the church at a certain point with the indulgences is an important factor there, but I think there are a lot of probably other factors, as well in what he's doing. And anyway, if it had just been a relatively limited abuse of one institution, it would never have had the effects that it seems to have had. So I think that's the important. In other words, what's really articulated there is therefore has to be more general a more general experience that which Luther is giving one particularly powerful expression to. Yeah. Oh, and what I just wanted to mention again about Kant in response to what you were asking is that Kant rejects the notion of art being mimetic, and or at least of beauty being mimetic. And the reason is because Kant really is concerned with what I'm calling the singular. His basic situation, he's not even interested in art primarily. He's interested in judgments of beauty because they seem to claim universal validity, while at the same time being made with respect to singular events and encounters that themselves cannot be universalized conceptually. So in other words, so it's also a question of how does anyone move from the encounter with something which is so strange that you don't have a concept for it to conceptual knowledge? How is that done without presupposing a kind of a vicious circle that you already in some latent way? This is what Plato does. Plato says, there's something like anamnesis. You can only recognize what you already in some sense know. You know this through sort of prior contact with the ideas. And Kant is not satisfied with that. And when Kant, for example, talks about nature, he said it's not at all the romantic nature that you might expect. It's nature as a kind of the possible absence of rules, as a kind of unlimited, unrecognized multiplicity and variety, you see. So that's why Kant is actually more interested in natural beauty, judgments of natural beauty, than he is artistic beauty. Because he says in the case of artistic beauty, you always know in some sense, or you think you know, that there's some governing mind that's been presiding, and therefore there is a concept. And therefore it's not the example of the kind of singular confrontation that he really is looking for. And if you come upon, let's say, a clearing in a forest, and it seems to have some sort of pattern to it, but it's not clearly made by somebody, then you're in the situation that Kant wants to deal with. Namely, it looks like it's regular, but you can't be sure of it, you see. And the question is how you react to that. So nature is really, for Kant, being experienced as a realm of what I would call radical heterogeneity, the realm of the emergence of the other, of difference, of variety, of multiplicity, and therefore of singularity. Singularity in the sense of encounter with something that doesn't fit into my existing concepts and knowledge, let's say. And that's why, and nevertheless produces something like a pleasant feeling that is shared, or should be shared, and that therefore produces the judgment, it's beautiful. But you're not really talking about the it as an objective entity. You're talking about the play of faculties that is supposed to produce, the play of imagination and understanding that it's supposed to produce in the observer, let's say. You see, so it's a subjective quality, but a universal, according to Kant, a universally shared subjective quality. And he gets into, it's very hard for him to try to figure out how to explain that subjective quality. He uses the notion of common sense, sensus communis, but really in the sense of shared sensibility, not in the sense of the way we would say common sense, things that are agreed upon and so on, but kind of a shared sensual appreciation or a shared sensual reaction to a certain encounter with something. How does he know that it's shared? He doesn't know that it's shared. He presupposes that it is. You see, he gives various arguments. I don't want to go too far in that, but the only point I wanted to make in connection again with your question is that as a result, Kant talks then not about the artistic beauty as resulting in Aristotelian manner from the imitation of models. Let's say you have great models, you imitate them, it's always something new, so it has to be something different. And it's connected with what he calls genius. And he says, well, how does it, is there any relationship between these geniuses, and so on, in a tradition? And he says that the geniuses don't imitate. They can't imitate one another. They succeed one another. They follow one another. In German, it's interesting because he uses almost the same word. In German, imitate is nachahmen, N-A-C-H, means after, and amen. And to succeed, in the sense of come after, is nachfolgen, nachfolge. Folgen is like follow, you see. And basically he's saying that the geniuses follow after one another. They don't imitate each other. And he's using almost the same word. They don't nachahmen, they nachfolgen. And that introduces the whole question of like seriality, you see what I mean, and sequence. But as discontinuity. You see, he's not saying that. And so there you have the idea that, in other words, since the aesthetic judgment of beauty has to be related to a singular experience and must never be understood as a concept, as something directly universalizable. It can't be taught, it can't be passed on directly, it doesn't want to be directly imitated, but it in some sense follows one from the other, you see. And what you get there is the idea of a certain history as a series of discontinuous events in which something comes which wasn't there, but which doesn't fit into whatever scheme is pre-existing. So you get the idea of a transformation and disruption there a little bit. And that's a very modern, I think, modern idea, an interesting one. The implications of that are also very interesting, because what that presupposes, in fact, the whole Kantian, the whole notion of singularity presupposes some sort of generality. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. If singularity is that which doesn't fit in, which resists integration into some existing scheme of things, it always presupposes some existing scheme of things. See, so it is never disembodied. It's always, and this gives you a sense of why it can be called successive or it presupposes something that comes before. What it presupposes in the post-structuralist sense that I was using, it presupposes that there's been a provisional agreement or consensus about a certain series of meanings, let's say, based on exclusions, not just inclusions, and what the experience of the singular somehow relates to what's been excluded in order that there be inclusion, in order that certain meanings take place and other meanings are excluded. And so it's situated, but it comes very close, those of you who know Hegel, to a Hegelian notion of negation, but it is not the same as negation. Why? Because the Hegelian notion of negation is a conceptual negation. It's absolutely fixed in its sequence. Whereas this notion of negation is a negation that doesn't necessarily, it's like Luther talking about God's grace. It never can't be directly adduced from what came before, but it presupposes what came before. See what I mean? It's always going to be something that will exceed an expectation. In other words, take the element of surprise, which has always been an important part of aesthetics. I mean, even Aristotle leaves an important role for surprise in his discussion of tragedy, let's say, and so on. Surprise presupposes expectation. If you're not expecting, even unconsciously, certain things, you can't be surprised. If you were to have a tabula rasa, there would be no surprise. That's at least my argument there. You have to have a certain set of what's likely to appear in order to be, hey, wait a minute, that's not what, So it's always in relation. This is why what I'm describing as singularity is historical and always requires an understanding of whatever the conventional expectations are that will then be in some sense upset by this encounter. So that singularity, as opposed to individuality, is constitutively relational and differential. That's the way I would put it, paradoxically. It's relational and differential because it presupposes that which it resists and can't be integrated, but it does presuppose that. And at the same time transforms it, and at the same time remains, in some sense, elusive. You can never grasp the singular as singular. It's the same problem that Kant has. You can't, when you say something is beautiful, you can't say, aha, the tulip is beautiful. You can say it, but it's not the tulip, qua member of a species tulip that's beautiful. It's this one here that may happen to be a tulip, but it's not its tulipness that can explain the experience of beauty. That's the way the singular works. If you name it, Kant says, for example, it's unnameable. And by that, I think it's also very interesting because it's translated in many of the English translations, including some of the most recent ones, as ineffable. Ineffable. It's not at all the same thing. Ineffable means you can't speak about it. But Kant gives lots of examples of speaking about it. In fact, in poetry, poetry is one of the examples. It can't be named properly, because once you name something properly, you've identified it, you see, and in a way that then allows it to be conceptualized and placed, located, etc., etc. So it can be named improperly, and that's what metaphor is, or figural language, you see. That's what poetic language often does. It names something, but it names it in a way that doesn't fix it. You have to then you have to follow further out. You see, follow how the names or nouns are functioning. Like, for example, in Shakespeare's sonnets, there's a big constant play between I as a personal pronoun and I as as the organ of sight, let's say. And there are lots of examples of that. You see, where a word seems to be functioning in a unified way, but it breaks down into different, but related. If it's good poetry, there'll be some relation between the two. It's not just totally, totally coincidental there. So the singular there is relational, is historical, but it's historical in a way you may have heard this word. I don't know you've been exactly who you've been studying with and who you've been reading, but one of the buzzwords in, let's say, this kind of post-structuralism is the word event. And it comes from Heidegger, but it means a lot. Well, the notion of the event, as far as I understand, I don't use it too often because I say it is a bit of a buzzword, is something that's unexpected. You see, it's and in a certain sense, American colloquial English works both ways there. An event is both something unexpected, but it's also something that's totally dateable and media event or something like that. So in English, it doesn't have the power that it has, let's say, in French or in German, where it's coming from, where it's less often used. You never use the word Ereignis, which is a word that Heidegger uses in German, or Evenement. There an event is something special, something special about it. In English, in American English at least, I think that we don't have that as much. So I think it's important not to pretend we do, or to decree that we should have it, because it'd be nice if we did, because Heidegger and everybody else thinks that it's a great word. But also take into account what we do have and why and so on, and how that relates. So this notion of event is tricky, and it's being used to describe this sort of a singular confrontation as constitutive of a historical sequence, in the way as a discontinuity, but never a total rupture. You see, that's the important thing to me. I never liked the idea that was fashionable for a certain period from Canguilhem and Foucault about the epistemological break, total breaks, because I think there's always a kind of negotiation going on. There's always a relation going on between the new and the old. It's more complex than the idea of a total rupture, would suggest. You see, there's always even in Luther, you see, there is a real break with certain aspects of Catholicism, but there's also a continuity. And Luther is very, clear on that. And I think it's almost always that way, that the relationships are more complex than the either or of the break. On the contrary, I'm very suspicious of the notion of the break, because I think it goes together with what I would call a kind of individualistic, compartmentalizing sense of the way reality is constructed, of self-contained images, or of self-contained events, or of self-contained objects. You see, if something is self-contained, then you can claim it is completely separate from everything that surrounds it, because its identity is totally internal. And that I'm very suspect. I think that does a lot of harm but it's also, I think, the basis of a lot of televisual reporting, for example. Is to get you. See, if something is self-contained in that way, then you can look at it, immediately understand what is being said, which means that you listen to the voice. It tells you what you should think, basically, and then you can go on to the next. You don't have to worry about connections. You don't have to worry about historical connections and complexities and things like that. So that's sort of so in any way, that's I can't give a univocal answer to why add that, but I do believe that there that is, I don't believe it's arbitrary. I believe it's always responding to complex causes and complex conditions, rather than in a way than causes, but precisely because they're complex and so on, and also because I would avoid the notion of any kind of simple causality. That I don't think is very, very helpful there. Any other questions on this stuff that's been raised so far? Anyway, feel free. I'd like to then, before we go on to Descartes, then just to read a little bit from the 95 Theses, just to make a little bit more concrete some of the things I was generally talking about this morning, about the atmosphere and the thrust of some of Luther's work, which is, this is another thing that I want to just mention as a kind of hermeneutical caveat. We use a proper name like Luther, so that, it doesn't matter, Freud, Shakespeare, whatever. And we assume, because it's a proper name, that there has to be a consistency and absolute sort of an underlying unity there. And I think one of the, there are a lot of reasons why we assume that, but because we like to assume that of ourselves as well. We're also unified and so on. But in fact, and that's why things really are complex, and why one should be very careful in making any kinds of assertions. You throw things out as hypotheses, see where they go, see what people can do with them, what you can do with them, but you shouldn't, be very careful to insist that this is the way it is. Because behind these, it's like, you pick up a stone and you get an anthill underneath it or something. There's, a name like Luther. Luther has a whole series of texts, a big body of written work and so on, and interventions, and they're extremely complex. Some of them, there's big shifts in emphases. He changes like anyone else changes, and it evolves. So I'm not saying this is the only Luther that there is. I'm using the word as a kind of shorthand to point to certain things that seem to me to be in his work, and but that certainly there are other things as well, and this is true of almost any thinker and writer and artist and so on. There are very few that are interesting that are monolithic, and so there's a kind of lure of the name, a trap, a temptation, because you think you can name something, this is the way it is and not that, and it also makes judging particularly, more complex, like with Nietzsche, for example. How do you judge Nietzsche? There are some, really awful things in Nietzsche, but there are also wonderful, very complex, interesting things in Nietzsche as well. And, it's almost the same with almost every writer, you see. So, in a way, when you're making judgments, it's important to say on what basis you're making them, and not to exclude the fact that there can be other aspects there. That's why it takes time, and why everything that I'm laying out here is in a way tentative, because I really haven't, in most of the cases, I haven't been able to do anywhere near the amount of exhaustive work that would really, be necessary. Particularly if you take the way I do texts to be extremely subtle and often to be implying things that they don't say outright. So that means it takes, they're complicated to read. You can't just speed read them. And you're dealing with large bodies of text. It adds another aspect to it. So basically, I'm arguing for a kind of respective complexity, and that there's a lot in our culture that goes against. I remember one time Ted Koppel on Nightline was sort of harassing one of the people he had invited. He said, "We only have 10 seconds before the commercial break. Yes or no? To this. Say yes or give me a yes or no answer. Anything else is considered to be, kind of equivocation and so on and so forth." So it's that kind of idea that you can give a yes or no answer in 10 seconds or less.
Noel Chomsky had a thing on that too, where he had a 10-minute speech where he talked about the fact that a lot of sort of media expositions of things are given like a 2-minute or a minute and a half segment to explain something that there's absolutely no way you could explain in a minute and a half.
Absolutely. No, I mean, really, that's the if there were one thing that I could change, or that should be changed about the media, it would be that. It would be giving people a chance. I'm a great fan. I don't know how many of you get a chance to watch Al-Jazeera in English. I can't see it, and I don't speak Arabic. I don't know how the Arabic is. But Al-Jazeera in English, there are real interview programs and so on, which give people a chance to explain. They also are interesting, invite people that you don't see usually, like Naomi Klein and so on, others, only on a few, marginal public radio programs. But they give them a chance to talk. People are informed. Rizkan, the guy who organizes it, he knows what he's asking about. He's respectful of the people he invites. And he invites from all over, from the different points of view. And so on. But it's important to have that, the time to be able to explain a certain complexity. That's what's so, both significant and I think really disturbing about the Tea Party movement. One of the things is the idea, I mean, out of a perfectly understandable frustration with lots of things that one should be, the idea that there is there's going to be a simple, yes or no kind of answer to it. We've had enough, now it's a time to, and so on. It's that idea, which I think, for me at least, is basically the political incarnation of Fox News and of Limbaugh and so on, where you sort of, scream and there's a whole new style of, radio and television reporting that is both on the right and on the left. The left, MSNBC repeats that to some extent, not totally, but to some extent. And, it's that kind of, people are tense, people are nervous, and they're looking then for the kind of, quick response that will bring relief, as it were, instant relief, and so on. But that often is really, really nefarious because it doesn't even begin to understand how complicated things are, and so on. That's a sort of a different thing. Anyway, let me just read a couple of these things just to round off the discussion of Luther here. When our Lord Master Jesus Christ said, this is the first of his 95 Theses, when he said repent, he called for the entire life of believers to be one of penitence. Entire life. In other words, not just a single act or something and so on. The word cannot be properly, second thesis, cannot be properly understood as referring to the sacrament of penance, i.e. confession, and satisfaction as administered by the clergy. And then he goes on, he says, the penitential canons apply only to humans who are still alive, and according to the canons themselves, none apply to the dead. So, and then he sums this up a little bit further, the 13th thesis, death puts an end to all the claims of the church. Even the dying are already dead to the canon laws and are no longer bound by them. Now this is important stuff, because I think he's putting his finger on one of the enormous, put it this way, selling points or power of the church, which is precisely to administer a kind of relief to those who are mortal and dying and so on. And he's saying, no, this, you don't have that. You don't have that right. That's not yours. So you see, there's a reevaluation of the significance of death as the result of sin, which he never doubts. On the contrary, it's even heightened. But with respect to the penitence or grace being administered by a human institution that is equally felt to be part of the fallen creation. That's one of the things that Benjamin emphasizes, both politically and every other way. He says that also in the case of the German Baroque, the sovereign who is called upon to make decisions is incapable of deciding. And so, because the sovereign recognizes that he himself is part of the sin of the creation that is sinful and therefore responsible, and therefore there's no intra-mundane, as it were, power that would allow him to save a collective, to hoist himself above this state of sinfulness. So the model of this sovereign is, on the one hand, Hamlet, who isn't a sovereign, who's a prevented from it, but even more, if you think of Shakespeare, Richard II. Richard II is, not the third, but Richard II, who abdicates and so on, is a sovereign that can't rule, that can't decide, and can't make up his mind. Something that Benjamin points to there as something. His interpretation seems to me, at least the way I read it, and I'm giving a very strong reading of it. I'm interpreting this in ways that he doesn't explicitly say, since he's writing specifically on the Baroque period. But it's that the expectation of redemption and of justification can no longer be maintained, can no longer be associated with established institutions or human actions, because the sense of human corruption and guilt has become so great that it requires some other type of solution, which Luther then identifies with this very difficult notion of faith, and which is more connected with the singular human being than with the collective there. Let me just read one or two others here. It must be the case that the major part of the people are deceived by the indiscriminate and high-sounding promise of relief from penalty. See, in other words, the church is, and maybe Christianity, but he doesn't say Christianity. The church is capitalizing on the anxieties and the fears that human beings have as recognizing themselves as sinful and as mortal because they're sinful. That's the key point. Human beings are mortal in the biblical and the Christian tradition because they are sinful. It's a punishment. It has a certain logic to it. You see, and that is very much missing from the Greek. That's why it's worth, even without being a specialist in Greek literature and culture and so on, if you read Greek tragedy, you see something very different. They're not. There isn't that sense of guilt. And what's interesting in Oedipus, and maybe I have a chance to talk about that, as Oedipus, particularly Oedipus at Colonus, is that he refuses. He says, I didn't do anything. There is nothing that I could have done. I mean, he killed his father, but he says he couldn't know. He didn't know, it wasn't in that sense responsible. And anyway, there was a curse that was placed on his family that he couldn't escape. He says, it's not my fault. It's the gods that deemed that. So to the very end, Oedipus, who is a kind of martyr figure, in some ways a kind of Christ figure at the very end, but it's very different. He's not redeeming the guilt of mankind because there is no recognition there of individual or collective guilt. Yeah.
There isn't even a recognition of guilt whatsoever. Greek culture wasn't obsessed with justice or guilt or sin. They were obsessed with cosmology. You had a place in the universe and a role.
That's right.
It wasn't about fairness or equality.
Right.
And if you overstepped your bounds, that was hubris.
Exactly.
It
Absolutely.
sin. Yeah.
So hubris is hubris. It's interesting because modern translators, even wonderful translators, really knowledgeable. The most knowledgeable that I know of is this man called Richard Jebb, who is commented. He was quite old. I mean, it's an old translation, but they have no problem using the word sin in talking about Greek. And it really it modernizes it at the cost of completely effacing the very important differences that are there. There is a mistake, hamartia. You make a mistake. That surely, but it's connected, as you say, to hubris, to not knowing the place, which is not the same as original sin. You see, but this is very crucial. This is not just an evaluation of human beings, because this is an explanation of why people die. You see, and this is what I'm getting at. This is what I think is really important in connection with terror. You see, that my line on that, and I've written a little bit on this in a book called what is it called? Something of Opportunity, Targets of Opportunity, which I saw one chapter is on the internet at least. So probably all on the internet. Once one student said, I don't know if you're going to be happy or sad about this, but here all your stuff is practically available peer-to-peer. I said, I'm very happy. I don't make any money on this stuff. I write it so that people can read it if they're reading it. I won't tell the editor, the publishers that, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy that people go to the trouble of doing that. If you write it, you don't just write it for yourself. You write it to be read and see what can come of it. So, but in there, I write a lot about this whole problem. It seems to me there of killing as being a way of legitimating life against death. It makes, in other words, one of the arguments there, I don't want to go into that too far, is that it would have made a huge difference if Jesus had died of cancer or of Parkinson's, or something connected with, he has to be killed. It's important. You see, but why? Because death comes into the world as a result of a human act. And the only way it can be redeemed and through a sacrifice is by another act, the act of taking it on oneself and of being killed by others. In this case, the Jews and so on, who do that. And so it's really very, very important. I'm one of the few people that in the academia who actually sort of enjoyed Mel Gibson's Passion of Christ. A, because it was nice to hear anything that sounded like Aramaic, which you never hear. And B, because it completely supported my theory. I have a footnote somewhere in that book on Mel Gibson, because the whole film is about guys being flagellated and tortured and so on by humans. It's not just an accident. That's crucial. And so that I talk about the idea of targeting as being which is now everywhere in economic discourse, and everything is targeted. There's not just targeted killings, but also, and try to see that as a way of a kind of secular redemption in this context in which death is something to be redeemed from. Basically, death is a result, is a punishment that can be somehow redeemed. You can be great. You can be pardoned in some sense. You can't not die, but you can be pardoned from the effects of death, and that's quite seems to me quite pronounced, and that's why I think that Luther is very aware of that and puts a lot of emphasis on that in these early theses by saying the major part of people are deceived by that indiscriminate and high-sounding promise of relief from penalty. And I think the word relief, I don't have the German here, but assuming this is a reasonably accurate English translation, relief is very important. You get a relatively temporary relief from something that doesn't go away. It stays there, and so it feeds. That's why the war on terror is eternal, and it keeps renewing, living off itself, as it were, and so on. And then the connection again. His irony, to give you a sense, in the relation to money. There is no divine authority for preaching that the soul flies out of purgatory immediately after the money clinks in the bottom of the chest. So but then you get something that's then you get something very, very interesting. This is thesis 30. No one is sure of the reality of their own contrition, much less of receiving plenary forgiveness. And this is going to be the segue to Descartes, the idea of sure, being sure, not being sure. Because the real challenge here is not just in the relation of the individual to others, to the church, but it's also the relation of the individual to oneself. What can you hope for? What can you do given this situation that Luther is describing? So it's not just the church that's in question, it's everything connected with all the judgments you can make about the phenomenal world, all the objects you can be conscious, all the resolutions you can make, and even your relation to yourself. So the whole issue in modernity displaces itself to some extent onto this internal relation of the self to itself. So is that something that can be understood and bridged over and unified through consciousness, or is it something that defies that resists that, and so on? And so that will enable me then to go over to the Descartes.